BBC.
Well, let's take you live to Westminster now on BBC Two, where Joe Coburn has today's political talking points.
Today, will making millionaires pay more tax save the economy? Will the government's Levelling Up Fund make your life better? And would you eat a burger grown in a lab? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative Party Deputy Chair Nikki Aiken, Labour MP Angela Eagle, City trader turned equality campaigner Gary Stevenson, and from the Institute of Economic Affairs, Annabel Denham. Today, £2.1 billion to level up the UK. We know where it's going, but will it work?
If you look at the funding and you compare it to the number of people that live in each region, the region that has done the best in the amount of funding per person is the North.
It's a one-off pot of money that pits communities against one another, creates winners and losers. It's a Hunger Games style competition.
King Charles is giving some of his millions back to the Treasury. Should more millionaires be made to do the same? This former city trader thinks they should, for the good of the economy. And would you rather eat a burger made of this or this? Can lab-grown meat cure our environmental woes? Let's start with a discrimination claim brought by a former Deutsche Bank worker who was nicknamed for her grey hair, Christine Lagarde. Christine Lagarde is the president of the European Central Bank. You can see her here, rather than the former banker from Deutsche Bank, who has lost that discrimination claim. It wasn't the entire case that she presented, but the judge ruled that the nickname, or jokes about grey hair, was just part of the irritation of day-to-day office life, which occasionally occurs. Is the judge right, Nikki?
Well, I think we have to put this in context, and I speak today as somebody who was mistaken by BBC Parliament this morning for Harriet Baldwin MP. You know, she appeared in the Commons and my name appeared under her name. So, you know, there's two older women in Parliament. We don't all look the same, I don't think.
So you're both Tory MPs. I suppose they got them from the right party,
yeah.
Yes?
Well, you know...
Neither of you've got grey hair.
No,
though.
neither got grey hair.
True.
Oh, well, that's because I may...
That's all right. We don't need to know about all your hairdressing issues. But do you think it is sexist? I mean, do you think these things are things that women should just put up with?
No, I don't think we should put up with it at all. No, gosh. I mean, look, you know, it's I'm 54. You know, I remember, you know, in the 80s and 90s, some of the actions and behaviour of my male colleagues at the time was appalling. And, you know, I called it out. I mean, I'm in a much better place today, but we still have got to call out such behaviour.
Right, call it out. But is it discriminatory?
Well, it depends on the context. There's always banter at work, but there's also, in some cases, bullying at work. And I don't know the context of this discrimination case. Obviously, if it's just comparing somebody to one of the most powerful women in the world in the financial area, then I would probably be quite flattered. But if it's on top of a load of other stuff, which is demeaning and bullying, then it can take on a different connotation. So you've got to look at the context, which is what employment tribunals are there for. We know what the difference between joshing and bullying is, and you know it when you're subjected to it, and you know it when you see it happening in the office. My best advice is to other colleagues who see somebody being picked on to call it out.
Is this the sort of comment that would have been made in some of the places where you worked as a city trader? And do you think this woman had a case, really, on jokes about being grey-haired because she's older?
There was definitely a lot of joking like this when I was on the trading floor. I was in my early 20s, so I definitely wasn't in my grey era at that time. I got teased quite a lot. What I got teased for is the way that I talk. You know, I'm from a pretty poor background, I'm from East London. There's not many people from my sort of background on the trading floor nowadays. But for me, what was important was, even though I came from that background and I talk how I do, they gave me a chance to trade against everybody else. And when they saw that I was a better trader than everybody else, I was the guy. And I think I've actually seen bigger problems after that, when I went to do a master at Oxford, since I've been in the media, people that speak like me are very rarely used to talk about economics. So for me, even though in the city I was teased, I was listened to. Whereas, you know, I often question in the media why there are so few people with regional accents who have experienced poverty talking about economics. I don't get teased here, but where are the voices?
And what about older people? As you say, you were in your 20s, it was your accent. You say that perhaps there weren't many people speaking like you who are economists. Do you think attitudes to older people in the workplace, in those sorts of workplaces, is a problem?
You know, a lot of people don't survive into their 40s
No, not as traders,
in
no.
trading. I mean, to be honest, it's a dog-eat-dog world for everyone in that space. But the one thing I liked about trading was you're judged on your results. So really, whatever your background, if your results are good, that's what matters.
Is it a problem for older people in the workplace, beyond banking and the city in general?
I don't believe so. I mean, look, if we're looking at this case with Christine Lagarde, Christine was France's first female finance minister. She was the first female head of the IMF, first female president of the ECB. Of all of the women that you could potentially be compared to in business, this is pretty favourable. But I think that this discussion speaks to the wider issue of the expansion of protected characteristics. And I think as that grows, we can expect the number of spurious claims of discrimination to grow.
Oh, you think this was spurious? Grey-haired jokes are acceptable?
I believe that, you know, the judge has looked at the evidence and ruled that discrimination was not at play. And I think it's important that we read about this so that more disgruntled employees potentially are not incentivised to come forward. I think ultimately nobody wants anyone to feel offended in the workplace. And it's interesting you talked about accents, because there was a survey before Christmas that found that 1 in 4 people are now saying they have been mocked on account of their accents in the workplace. So no, we don't want anybody to be offended, particularly not when they're in the office. But sometimes a joke is just a joke. And sometimes, unfortunately, people are made redundant and discrimination isn't at play.
But it goes back to the very important point that we need more women in positions of power. I mean, we need more older women in positions of power so that, you know, we can hopefully cancel out this type of behaviour.
Yes, and then I suppose it won't be noticed as much, having older
There's a
workers.
difference between joshing and bullying.
Yeah, certainly.
And those who are subjected to it know what it is when it's happening, and those who are around watching it happen know too. And if it's got descended into bullying or picking on somebody, then that ought to be dealt with
If
and
it's
called
systematic,
out.
you know, as Andrew says, there's a very big difference.
All right, well, let's turn our attention to wealth. You heard in the headlines, King Charles, multi-millionaire, has asked for a surge in profits from the Crown estate in offshore wind farms to be used for what he called the wider public good. So it would mean that some money set aside for the sovereign grant. You can see here the headline in the Times, King's Crown Estate wind farm to generate £1 billion for Britain. It would be set aside normally for the sovereign grant, which runs the royal household. But in this case, he's suggesting it be retained by the Treasury and can be used for public spending. So should the rest of the rich be doing something similar? What do you make of the King's decision and announcement today? A good?
Oh, it's very generous of him. You know, I wish I had £1 billion I could donate away and be able to afford. But it's not enough. It's not enough. In the last 3 years, the government's given out £700 billion. That would be enough to give £14,000 to every single adult in the country. Now, if you're going to give out that amount of money, you need to do an analysis of where that money's going to end up. You have to. And at the beginning of COVID, I was screaming out, let's do an analysis of who's going to end up with the £700 billion. The Conservatives didn't do it, Labour didn't do it, the BBC didn't do it. So I did it, and what I found out was that money was going to overwhelmingly end up with the richest people in society. That's enough money to give the richest 5 million adults in this country £140,000 each.
Now, you were a millionaire. You earned £1 million in your first 2 years, you say, as a trader. You've changed your mind about how the world should work, how capitalism should work in the UK. What sort of triggered your Damascene conversion?
The way I became a millionaire is after the 2008 crisis, I realised that because of a massive growth in inequality, we would basically never come out of that crisis. And I started to put massive bets on that the economy would get worse and worse and worse. And within a year of doing that, I became Citibank's most profitable trader in the world. So, you know, if your job is to look at the economy and analyse it, and your analysis is the economy is going to get worse and worse because of inequality, and then you are judged to be the best trader in the world, I think it you have a responsibility to do something about it.
Cynics would say that's after you earned all that money. That's
well, I
when
was
you saw the
24.
light.
You know, you have to give me a bit of time.
What do you think, Annabelle, about the thesis being put forward by Gary in order to tackle growing inequality as he sees it?
Well, I think inequality is very difficult to measure and there are massive fluctuations. So if you look at something like the Sunday Times Rich List, it's not the same names that are there year in, year out. Wealth is accumulated over time. So you can end up in a situation where if you've had a very low birth year, actually, 20 years later, inequality has gone down. But that's not necessarily due to the society becoming more equal or any policies that the government has introduced. I mean, look, I think everybody is uncomfortable to varying degrees with inequality, the idea that you have billionaires out there in possession of super yachts, whereas there are some people who are struggling to get by in the world on $2 a day. But the question is, what policies can you implement? I mean, it's virtually impossible to have some kind of wealth tax at a global level. How would you assess that? And once you'd assessed it, let's say that's possible, how on earth would you redistribute it? And at the national level, implementation really isn't any easier. To even assess people's wealth would be very difficult. It would be very invasive. I think it would throw up all sorts of concerns around property rights. This is, let's not forget, money that has been taxed on acquisition that you are then looking at taxing further.
Well, what are the policies, Gary? What would you do?
Lots of things are difficult, but some things are important, OK? If you give out £700 billion, you need to know where that money's gone to, OK? If you're giving hundreds of thousands of pounds to the richest people in the country, you have to expect inflation, a cost of living crisis for ordinary people. Listen, we increased inequality at the fastest rate in the history of this country during a time when the economy was closed. You are making ordinary families poorer. That is the cause of this crisis.
But
if you don't fix it...
Just to explain, you're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds being handed out during the pandemic, in part, so during the furlough scheme. The argument from the government, and I'll let Nikki and Angela in a moment, was that it kept people's jobs. It paid people's wages. What were they to do instead?
You do the analysis where the money will end up. Listen, I was there. I'm an inequality economist. I wanted to know where does it end up. OK, the money goes to furloughed workers. It's £14,000 per adult. Do you think furloughed workers are £14,000 richer? They're not, because they weren't getting their wages. OK, well, who's got the wages? The corporations. Well, were the corporations richer? In general, not, because they were closed. Who's got the money? The customers. But not all customers, because it was only luxury, non-essential spending that stopped during COVID.
Nikki, do you want to defend furlough and the decisions made by the government during that time? Of course, there are lots of allegations about billions being wasted.
Just to be clear, I'm not against furlough. What I'm against is not analysing where the money ended up and not doing anything about it accumulating with the richest people in society.
Well, they would say there wasn't enough time to do it. But, Nikki?
Well, look, I think, we had to act at the time. We were in, the once-in-a-100-year pandemic. We spent £400 billion. That's now got to be paid back, and that's part of...
but who's got the money now?
So let's look at... You say that you want to tax more of the wealthy. Well, let's look at the facts. Now, the top 1% of taxpayers now contribute 30% to the Treasury.
And are the top 1% of taxpayers the richest people?
In the last Labour government under Gordon Brown, it was 24%. So there is an increase in the wealthy paying more tax to
taxpayers
the
are not I pay tax.
I pay tax.
Yeah, exactly. Working people pay tax. The wealthiest people don't pay tax. They pay much, much lower rates of tax.
Right, and why is that? Is that because they can afford to move their money elsewhere? Is it because they can afford to leave the country?
You know what? I might question it's partially because we have a Prime Minister whose father-in-law is one of the richest men in the world. We have a previous Prime Minister who went on to make millions of pounds as soon as he left office. David Cameron made £10 million in a year of leaving office. If you put tax decisions in the hands of people who are extremely rich or about to become extremely rich, do you think they will say, let's tax extremely rich people?
All right, Nikki?
I think that's such a cheap shot. Keep throwing at the Prime Minister. He comes from the background he comes from. He's worked hard, like you, in the city, and he's made his contribution.
And he's presided over the biggest increase in inequality in the history of the country.
Gary, I can see your point that we tax income and wealth differently, and this is potentially problematic. But I still am a little bit unclear as to what your solution is. And let's not forget, let's look at the example of France, where Mitterrand introduced the wealth tax in 1982, and it was a failure. It turned out that it brought in around half as much as it cost. So even if you accept the thesis, what's the solution?
Right.
I mean, firstly, the Treasury Select Committee, which has a Tory majority on it, recently looked at the tax system and did not rule out a wealth tax.
Is Labour going to...
Well, it's not our policy to have a wealth tax.
No.
It's our policy
Why
to
not?
have... Listen, let me finish.
I will.
You've not let me in, and now you won't let me finish
I will.
the sentence.
No, Angela, you are part of the conversation.
Thank you. That's very good to know. The Treasury Select Committee pointed out how difficult it is to do wealth taxes in anything other than a one-off way, because people move their money around and you've got to have international agreements to do it, because capital and wealth is so mobile at the moment. But let's look at the situation. Since the pandemic started, the richest 1% have pocketed 26 trillion of the wealth that has been generated in the world. Now, that is not a sustainable position for humankind. It's not socially sustainable. It's actually not economically sustainable. So we have to move to a world where there are fairer tax systems and more redistribution to people who currently are at work and are not earning enough to live on, to get by on, who are working and have to go to food banks, who are right at the front end of the cost of living crisis. Socially, you cannot deal with that. Now, even the IMF now says that we have to have what it calls inclusive growth. That means environmentally and socially sustainable. To do that, we have to have a fairer tax system which takes more money off people who are doing very, very well and redistributes it to the people whose work is the lifeblood of the economy. And that is the values that the Labour Party has.
They're the values, but what are the policies that Labour would put in place to get back some of that money that you've talked about? You've talked about non-dom status.
Let's take another example. A windfall tax, for example. If you look at the windfall profits of the energy companies at the moment, the current windfall tax that Rishi Sunak has introduced isn't even raising very much money at all, because there's big offsets for investment allowances. So we've got to have a more effective windfall tax to do with some of the undeserved and unexpected profits that corporations are making. There are many, many things you can do to generate money that you can then use to put into the productive areas of the economy, to make the move, for example, to net zero carbon, to do some of the transformations that we need in our infrastructure.
All right, we'll let Nikki respond.
Well, we can't do any of that if we continue to take money out off companies. If we give them tax breaks for investment, so they are investing back into the infrastructure, that's going to create more jobs. It's then going to create more tax receipts. That's the way to do it.
Well, by the way, it might help if we didn't have an ex-chancellor who's been chased around by the...
we'll come to that. We'll come to Nadhim Zahawi.
And has had to pay his back taxes because he's been trying to avoid paying them.
All right, but let's get back to the idea about how you actually get this wealth back. Yeah. We've set out some of the issues, or rather you have, but how do you do it? How do you actually put in place wealth taxes that Annabelle says doesn't work? Labour, Angela says, aren't really looking at a wealth tax. So assets like property, it doesn't look as if they're going to be part of the picture, partly, maybe rightly or wrongly, but they're not going to be part of it. In the Daily Telegraph, the entrepreneur businessman James Dyson, also a millionaire, stupid, short-sighted Tory policies are holding back the economy, criticising the burden of regulations, increasing tax on companies that he says will cost you dear at the ballot box. Is he right?
Look, I think we've got to... Look, I'm a low-tax, small-state Conservative, and I want to see tax cuts. And, you know...
They're not coming, are they?
Well, let's see what's happened. Let's see what happens in the budget. Let's see what happens in the next budget. No. You know, we've got to move move our growth agenda on, of course, but we've also got to ensure that we pay for COVID, we pay for the cost of living, and we ensure that we pay for the war that's in Ukraine.
What do you say to James Dyson? I mean, he is a wealth creator, he would say, and he doesn't want regulation and high taxes in order to create jobs and pay those people.
Well, I've never met James Dyson. He might be a very nice guy.
I haven't either.
He's a very wealthy person, and he doesn't want tax on the very wealthy. I don't think I need to say more than that. But what I'm saying is, what I'm seeing from this discussion is a government that's given out £700 billion and has done no analysis of where the money's gone.
Well, you've said that, but that's
you don't even know who's got the money now.
But you left your job in the City trading in 2014. Yes. More broadly speaking, what is the answer? What are the policies that either Labour or Conservatives could do that would actually bring back some of the wealth from the super rich, if we're going to call them that, and redistribute it?
There are some low-hanging fruit which should obviously be done. You should equate capital gains with income tax. There's no reason why the wealthy pay less on that rate. You should close the loopholes, obviously, but you need to bring in something that will transfer that wealth back. If you're willing to give £700 billion to the richest and do nothing to bring it back, then ordinary families pay the price. So you need to bring in serious moves to
You've
redistribute.
also got to deal with offshore tax evasions. You've got to deal with these packages of offshore companies that allow people to export their money and avoid paying taxes.
Yeah.
You've got to deal with profit shifting in global multinational corporations.
At the
Some of
moment,
this
you
has
have-
got to be done by international agreement. But the fact is, as Thomas Piketty, the economist, says, we're now in a situation where the wealthy are going to get more and more wealthy, and wealth is actually going to accumulate without stopping because growth levels are lower than the amount of money you can get on your wealth in interest. So what's happening is that the billionaires index, the Bloomberg billionaires index, has to be updated every day.
Well, I mean,
because
Annabelle, isn't there
global billionaires' wealth is rising so much it's obscene, and we need to, as a global international community of politicians and economists, do something about it.
Right, well, hang on. Let me bring in Annabelle on this, because, you know, the idea of trickle-down economics, this idea that you allow the most wealthy, or certainly some of them, to spread that wealth, and they're encouraged to do so. It didn't work broadly, did it, under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, which was seen as an example of that trickle-down economics?
Mistakenly seen as an example of trickle-down economics. That's a fallacy. I don't think any economist, certainly not any free market economist, has ever used the expression trickle-down economics. The idea seems to be that if you, grow the pie, the wealthy get richer, they spend more in the economy, and that wealth gets transferred to the poorest in society. Well, if that were true, then you would simply strip the assets of the rich and give them to the poor. Why not just cut out the middleman? Why incentivise them, or take the money, incentivise them to go and spend in the economy? I think
but
what
Liz Truss
concerns
was
me about
following
this
the IEA's dogma,
I don't believe there's a single
to the letter.
piece of research, publication,
I
blog,
don't see
article,
why
a single
the
member of the IEA
can
or anyone
even
associated
come
with
onto
us has
programmes
ever
like
mentioned
this
the term trickle-down economics.
Don't talk over
and
each other.
A concern that I do have is
would be
that so
ashamed
much
if
of
I
the
was in the
debate now
IEA.
around improving the lives of the poorest seems to be fixated on the wealthiest. How do we implement punitive taxes?
Well, it's the inequality, isn't it? The gap
billionaires?
between the
But
wealthy.
I'm reasonably relaxed about inequality. Of course, I don't
Do
like
they
the
fund
idea
it?
that...
Do the
Let me finish.
billionaires-
Hang on.
It's important you let me finish
the
this.
sentence.
I don't like the idea, of course, that you have billionaires with super yachts and you have people who are living on $2 a day in this world. I don't think anybody is comfortable with that. However, if the lives of the poorest are being improved, continually improved, then even if the super rich are getting richer, you're still seeing improvements in the quality of life of the poorest in society.
Is that true?
So it's not
For me, this is not about inequality. This is about living standards of the ordinary people of this country. If you give £700 billion to the richest people in the country when the economy is closed, they will spend that money, drive up prices, and ordinary families increasingly will not be able to afford the basics like food and energy. Listen, if you give this money to the rich, it affects ordinary people.
So what is your solution?
A wealth tax, enforced spending. Listen,
But would you not accept that all of the downsides to wealth taxes, the fact that almost everywhere that they've been tried, they've subsequently been reversed?
You're talking to somebody who has made
worked.
millions of pounds by betting that the economy will collapse every single year, OK? And I'm betting on that right now, and I don't want it to happen. If you do nothing about growing inequality, if you don't do anything about growing inequality, poverty will get worse and worse and worse. And I'm telling you now, listen, in a few years' time, when it happens, when things are worse, remember this day.
It's not
and you can't say you
socially
didn't know about it.
sustainable to run a global economy with this level of inequality. It's not economically sustainable because there aren't enough consumers with enough money to make the economy work. So it's not fair in any way. And I don't know who funds the IEA. I don't know who funds the IEA, but I bet it's not the poor. I bet it's the billionaires that you're defending at the moment.
What about the economic downsides of introducing a wealth tax?
I just want to show, I think we've got some pictures of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, the Labour leader and the Shadow Chancellor in Davos at the World Economic Forum. I mean, there have been various reports, Labour schmoozing the wealth creators at this forum. Is Labour going to do anything that's radically different, Angela, to what we are seeing now under this government?
Yes, we've said we'll have a fairer tax system.
A fairer tax system, but not taxing the rich, the top 5% in the way that was pledged.
We have to have sustainable growth, and that's about environmentally and socially sustainable policies and tax policies which lead to a more equal society. Form part of that.
All right,
so
let
the
me get Nikki in
direction of
because
travel
she hasn't had much
is
of a
to
say.
fairness.
All right, Nikki, I want to ask you also about Nadeem Zahawi because it was mentioned by Angela. You're a deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. He is the chairman. He's facing questions about whether he is in a conflict with HMRC, the tax office, over millions of pounds. Now, we've heard from the Prime Minister that his tax affairs are in order. Have you had a conversation with him?
No.
Are you going to?
About his tax affairs.
Well, about the questions.
My colleagues about tax affairs.
Well, about the questions, because it's been out in the press. I mean, is it uncomfortable?
Oh,
is it difficult?
But he's been very clear that he's paid all his tax, and as the Prime Minister said, that his tax affairs are up to date. So, and I think going back to this discussion we've just had about a wealth tax for me equates to socialism, and socialism has never worked in the world. Never. Give me an example of when socialism has worked. And we have got to create more wealth in this country for everybody, and we do that by cutting taxes and growing the economy.
Well, firstly, you're not growing the economy. Secondly, you're presiding over the largest tax burden that we've had since the Second World War.
And why is that, Angela?
Because whilst you're describing yourself as a low-tax conservative.
I am.
All right.
You can't have it both ways. Look at what you've delivered.
Let her answer.
It's low tax for
If I could get a word in edgeways.
It's low tax for some people.
I'm going to let Nikki answer, and then we'll move on.
Nadeem Zahawi.
Look at the facts. We have come through a pandemic when we spent £400 billion. I do not think we should allow our children and our grandchildren to pay that debt. And we've now got a cost of living crisis basically because of the energy crisis. And the government has put billions of pounds into supporting particularly the most vulnerable over the last few months and moving forward. But I think about wealth tax, we should not be creating more tax, we should be cutting tax.
All right, well, you're very clear on that. We're going to talk about something else which is sort of related, levelling up. It's the great mantra of Boris Johnson and continues under Rishi Sunak. More than 100 schemes, it's been announced today, have won government funding in the second phase of the Levelling Up Fund. It's worth about £2.1 billion. It's not an insignificant amount of money. Let's give you an idea about how it's going to be spent. Some of it, £50 million for New Eden project in Lancashire, £45 million for the Port of Dover, £50 million to improve rail links in Cornwall, and a new train line there, £50 million between Cardiff Bay and Cardiff Central. We can play you a little bit of Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, who is out and about in Lancashire today.
We're investing hundreds of millions of pounds across the north in dozens of projects. I'm here talking to you from Accrington. I'm just off to Morecambe after this. Then I'm over to the northeast. And the thing you need to know, actually, if you look at the funding and you compare it to the number of people that live in each region, the region that has done the best in the amount of funding per person is the north.
Nikki, has it been distributed fairly, this money?
Yeah, and if you look at the cost per capita, and I think that's really important.
So per head, per population,
yeah. Wales is, I think it's £68 per head. The North West, where I know Angela represents, is 48. London is 17. So I think it's really important to look at the facts. Yeah. Of course, there will be people who are disappointed, but I do think if you look at the first tranche of the Levelling Up Fund and the second, we have got a blanket coverage.
Is it going to be transformative, though, to people's lives? I mean, we've just been talking about the economy and issues of inequality and tax and billions of pounds. Is this going to transform people's lives when we've got the NHS in the condition that it is for all sorts of reasons, and people are trying to heat their homes?
It's down to the local authorities, the local councils, and the mayors where they've got mayors to make it work, and it's about local accountability. That's why I think it's really important that we have the devolution into the regions so that local people can make those decisions. And if they don't like what's happening, they can vote their councils out and get people who they want in to transform their local areas.
I mean, do you think it's a good idea? I mean, you'd welcome... We've had Labour colleagues of yours coming on saying that it's great that they're having money in their local areas.
Of course, it's good when people get money in their local areas, but we've got to put it into context. 15 billion council cuts to council budgets, and this is 2.8 billion given back. So that's a lot less money going locally.
But there's a distinct shift to... It's not revenue budget, it's capital budget.
There's a distinct shift to Tory-held seats in this. I think it's
being
misallocated. No,
that is true.
But I think you're trying to keep them by misusing the allocations in a political way.
That's
I think £19 million to Rishi Sunak's constituency. And by the way, he's jetted himself up on a private jet again for the third time in the last couple of weeks.
Should he have jetted up on a plane?
Why can't he get on the train?
Look, Carrick, where in Richmond, in Rishi Sunak's constituency, is a Indie Lib Dem council. So you can hardly say that a Conservative council has...
Oh, hang on, Angela, don't interrupt, because it's difficult for the viewers to hear. Go on.
He openly boasted about taking money off Labour-held areas and giving them to Tory
He did in a
areas
video. He said that there are poorer areas in parts of the country that are broadly affluent, but even in the southeast, there are poorer areas that need funding. Is it a good idea? Is this going to transform people's lives in these areas?
Well, I mean, if I take £15 off you and then give you £2.80, is that going to transform your life? These guys, they've found £2.8 billion to give to local councils. In the last 3 years, they've given £700 billion to the rich.
I know you've met
50 times as much. Listen, is it levelling up if I give a poor person £2.80 and I give a rich person £250? No, sorry, £700. 250 times as much. Listen, this government has presided over the largest and fastest ever increase in inequality in the history of the country. And the most Orwellian thing you've ever heard, they call that levelling up.
What do you say?
I think in this case we're talking about relatively trivial amounts of money for projects that often ought to be financed by the private sector. I think this really underscores the problem with things like the Levelling Up Fund, which is that they create anomalies, and then the case is always made for more. The government comes under pressure to spend more, and we need to remember that the state's resources are not inexhaustible, even if there is always a case to be made for more. I'm quite sceptical of this whole concept of levelling up, or at least the way that the government seems to be going about it. Successive governments have thought that throwing money at left-behind areas would enable them to level up, and successive governments have failed. So I would much rather that we looked at ways of encouraging businesses through tax cutting, through deregulation. And I think if you spoke to constituents in a lot of these areas, they would be much keener on jobs and opportunities that could provide than they would be on state handouts.
I mean, this was
only 5% of the first tranche of this money has been spent so far, and they're busy talking about the second.
And why has
tranche,
it not been spent? Is that down to local authorities'
well, I think
inability to spend it, and there was a pandemic?
The government cannot get their act together and govern the country properly.
It's about the local
They're governed by.
Well,
they're governed by press release.
Well, we know how you feel, but on this, on levelling up, what can you say to actually people in those red wall areas, those areas who used to vote Labour, but changed in the 2019 election and voted for the Conservatives? Are they going to be satisfied with the amount of money that has gone to those parts of the country or not?
I hope they're going to be satisfied that they're going to see, their high streets changed from the money that they're receiving from the government.
Are they?
Well, I hope so, because, what has shocked me, Joe, over the last few years is how forgotten these areas are by local authorities, predominantly Labour-run local authorities, for 20 or 30 years.
Hang on.
And having run a local authority myself, it is a difficult job, but it is about prioritising and ensuring that you can invest in the local areas, that you can create jobs, and that you can create a community that is proud of itself.
What will Labour do? Devolution has been very much a buzzword. The former Labour Prime Minister Gordon Brown did a large and long paper on it. But apart from devolution, wouldn't people prefer cash?
Well, I think the point is that you take down to the local level instead of the opposite. This government has done the opposite by massacring local council budgets over the last 13 years. What you do is you get the money and you give it to local authorities who know how best to spend it in their local areas and make them accountable to their local voters.
But we've had
the opposite
where
of
local
that.
authorities have forgotten their communities. And that
Sorry,
they haven't
you've decimated their budgets. In my own local authority area, Wirral,
But why did they
we've
vote?
had
Why
an
did they vote?
80%
Angela, hang on.
cut.
But Angela, the question is, why did they vote Conservative in 2019?
Well, that's a
in that
different
case?
issue. I would say a lot of it was about Brexit and a lot of the
Not
lies that
necessarily.
were
They've been
told in the
forgotten.
2019
Have you got-
election.
but hang on,
But also
the austerity years. I'm sorry. The austerity years.
Run for 30
Listen,
or 40 years.
the
Shall I
austerity.
tell you something? If you
the
talk over each other, the audience just can't hear,
The
and I get a load of
austerity
complaints
years
on Twitter. Yes.
The austerity years saw massive cuts to the most vulnerable
All right,
areas
you've made that
in
point.
my own
Nikki,
local authority.
well, respond to
and
that.
then you cannot complain
Angela,
about.
can I get a word?
Yes.
But you cannot complain about things
Please.
being neglected when you've cut the budgets of the local authorities. That
All
are
right.
responsible
Please,
for
can I have a
Nikki.
word? Look, looking at the facts, many of these local authorities, particularly in the red wall seats, have been Labour-run for 40, 50 years, and they were forgotten under Labour, and now under a Conservative administration, they are receiving funds for the first time, for many, many years, and hopefully these Labour councils will change their tune and will use this money to benefit their local authorities. If not, people can vote them out.
Enough bickering. But finally, local authority budgets have been cut. I mean, Angela
Yeah,
is right. Over the years, they have been cut. Have you had complaints from Conservative colleagues who haven't got money after being asked to promote this levelling up?
I haven't spoken to anybody about it, either way.
Right, so no one's come to you and
Not for me,
complained.
no.
All right, well, let's move on. Let's talk about something completely different. Annabelle, you have a new report out from the Institute of Economic Affairs to do with lab-grown meat. Tell us about it.
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that although this sounds like something in the realm of science fiction, it is underway, but is nonetheless very much in the early days. So we're setting out what lab-grown meat is, what the process involved is, and what the huge impact lab-grown meat could have on the environment. Let's not forget that intensive farming is very damaging for the environment. Massive energy use, water use, land use, deforestation. It's potentially damaging for human health. Look at the risk of antibiotic resistance and the amount of antibiotics that are administered to livestock. So it can bring all sorts of benefits obviously around animal welfare.
Why has the IEA chosen to do this?
Because I would say the IEA is broadly very pro-innovation. This is actually a really exciting innovation that can deliver greater consumer choice, but also, as I say, those massive benefits to the environment, to human health.
Well, let's talk to beef and sheep farmer from his farm in Somerset, Stuart Clapworthy. Thank you very much for joining us today, Stuart. Give us your reaction to what you've just heard from Annabelle about lab-grown meat being the future, particularly if it's deregulated.
It's absolute rubbish. I've never heard anything in all my life. We are British agricultural farmers. We produce some of the best quality food in the world, and they want to spoil what we're doing by growing this, a burger in a lab. I've never heard nothing like it in all my life.
Would you eat one? Would you try one, a lab-grown?
I wouldn't. No, I would not. I would not. It's absolute. Our welfare, our animals, is the highest in the world. We produce the finest quality meat in the world, and they just want to spoil it. They just want to turn around and kick us in the teeth all the time. How do you expect the youngsters to come and go into the industry when you're doing this?
All right. Well, Annabelle, can you persuade Stuart?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that in the short to medium term, this is very much about expanding consumer choice. This is about supplementing rather than replacing conventional meat. So I don't imagine that it will have all that much impact on farmers, at least in the short to medium term. But nonetheless, the opportunities, as I've set out, are huge. And what we don't want to see is the UK falling behind. Currently, under retained EU law, we adhere to the Novel Foods Regulation, which is a 25-year-old regulation that was brought in and when at the time there were a lot of panics and food scares around mad cow disease and GM, and that really needs to be revised. Even the government's food strategy made the case for a review of the Novel Foods Regulation. So it's really about ways in which we could potentially make the regulatory regime more favourable to encourage entrepreneurs, innovators to come here to set up the businesses in their
Let me just hear again for Stuart, what do you think about that? What would it do to your industry if there was a massive expansion of lab-grown meat?
Oh, it would hit us. It would hit us. It would hit us. All right, we got a butcher shop as well. I'm lucky enough to have a butcher shop. So where are we producing the lambs? What's behind me? We're producing the lambs for environmental. They are going from the farm straight off to go into the shop. There is no travelling hardly involved. The sheep, the lambs are living the best of their lives. There's no travelling. That is helping the environment.
All right. Well,
instead, I think.
Right. All right. That may not be true for all farmers, though, and the way all food.
No. But what we're saying is, they are about the environment. We are, as a country, we are importing meat from Brazil and all over the place to come halfway across the world, and we are producing our own stock here. And that is surely more friendly for the environment than it is carting it across the world.
All right, well, let me ask our other guest. What do you think about deregulating lab-grown meat? Would you eat a lab-grown burger?
I'll give it a go, I don't mind. My main thought is, I think it's very interesting that the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, has a chance to come on a show like this and talk about a disaster in the economy that partially they caused by inspiring Liz Truss's economic policies, which were a disaster. And instead of grabbing the bull by the horns and talking about this disaster, which is damaging tens of millions of people's lives, they ask us to talk about lab-grown meat.
And what do you think about it?
About lab-grown meat or about the IEA?
Well, you've done the IEA, about lab-grown... You're not a fan of either. What do you... I mean, in terms of the environmental case that Annabelle has presented, can they live, can they coexist?
I think at the moment, a burger grown in the lab would cost about £100,000. So, I mean, it'd have to be a bloody good burger, and I don't think there'd be an awful lot of people going into McDonald's to buy a burger for 100,000 quid.
Annabelle?
You can now buy chicken nuggets in Singapore for less than £100,000, but that's the whole point. It's encouraging businesses to enter into this space, to seek investment, to grow, to progress and develop this product, as we've seen across, innovations throughout history.
But why do you want to deregulate it then? I mean, why are you so obsessed when there's new novel things with deregulating everything? I don't think people in this country would feel that something was this new and novel could be safe if it was just deregulated the whole time. I mean, this obsession.
Well, let her answer
that. We're lagging behind the US, Singapore and Israel at the moment. And let's not forget, it's not just the UK government that's coming under pressure to deregulate, it's also the EU and governments across the globe. At the moment here in the UK, it takes around 35 months for approval to go through regulatory process, which is obviously very lengthy. It creates quite a lot of uncertainty, which again disincentivises investment and therefore slows the development of these products. So it's not about full-scale deregulation. Of course, food standards are very important. It's just about looking at 25-year-old regulation and how that could possibly be reviewed, which, like I said, was included in the government's food strategy.
Is this going to be embraced by your constituents, Nikki, this idea of lab-grown meat, if it becomes, in the future, cheaper, easier to create, more environmentally friendly, according to Annabelle?
Well, I think the report does lift up the subject of food security and how we are going to feed people in this country and across the world, over the decades to come. We have a growing population. I'm not saying I really want to try a lab-grown burger, but I do think that we have
point of agreement between you and Angela, finally. Well, that's something.
But I do think we have to look at how we are going to feed our nation and about science and about, the investment in R&D, which the government is really pushing at the moment. And the fact is that the British economy does lead in R&D.
Right. I mean, but what would you say to Stuart? Because it could lead to the end of Stuart's farm in the future and his beef and his cattle, I should say, and sheep. I'm sure there's no way, Stuart, to Stuart and to all farmers, that we are ever going to replace him and his brilliant lambs and his brilliant beef. I think I would prefer to have a Stuart beef burger than a lab-grown burger any time. Right. Well, Stuart, does that reassure you, Stuart?
That do reassure us, but the problem is they say about producing food for the future. When we are losing so much land in this island, we are using so much land for other uses. We are drawn now to turn around and to produce food. And if you're taking the productive land away from us and growing and doing solar panels and things like that, and we cannot use the land to produce food,
all right,
how can we keep...
All right. Well, Stuart, thank you very much for joining us with your animals behind there. Technical solutions, are they not to be considered properly when we're looking at things like climate change and the environment?
Yeah, for sure. If they work, if they're just...
But how will you know if they work unless you try them?
Well, I think you should give them a go, but if you're just using them to distract from your own disastrous economic advice, then I think it's probably not a good idea.
I mean, you obviously believe in investment in climate change policies to a huge extent. Is science going to be the answer here?
It will form part of the answer, there's no doubt about that. And we're very good in this country at being innovative, but we're not so good at turning our innovations into big British companies. So that's what we would be looking at if we were in government.
I don't think everyone is really attracted to the idea of lab-grown beef, certainly not on this panel, Annabelle.
Well, I'll make it my personal mission to change their minds.
All right, good for you and good luck. That's all for today. I'm exhausted, but thank you very much to all of our guests. I will be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.
Mad one. They're talking about lab-grown meat. You know you could feed the world on fucking insects. How about that? Just dried insects. There's more protein in an insect than there is in a sirloin fucking steak, given its relative size, that is. No jokes. So, when we run out of food, rate the bugs. Just eat bugs. Be fine. They're not going to kill you. Disgusting looking things to eat, though, to be fair. Should wrap them up in something so we can't tell the bugs, probably. But yeah, anyway. Bug burger. Oh, no way. Do you know how many bugs are in burgers anyway? In like McDonald's, there's like quotas and stuff for how much shit they can put in your food without telling you. It's pretty disgusting. Anyway, back Sunday, not tomorrow, I don't do Fridays. Fuck that. Back on Sunday, Laura Koonsberg. Oh, back tonight actually. Question time, forgot. Question time's on at 10:30, so I'll be back tonight.